Hi, I'm Crawford Coates, Content Marketing Manager here at Lexipol, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The Ready Responder, How Physical Well-Being Affects Performance. You'll receive a recording of the webinar at the end of the day today, and in a separate email, you'll also receive a certificate of your attendance. We're not using a PowerPoint presentation today. However, slides are available in the webinar console. Just as a reminder, today's webinar is for educational purposes only and should not be taken as legal or medical advice. Now I will introduce you to our illustrious panel, starting with Lois James, Assistant Dean of Research at Washington State University, College of Nursing, where she focuses on bias, stress, sleep, and performance in high-stress populations, such as police officers, military, nurses, and top-tier athletes. With us also is Dr. David Black, the founder and CEO of Cortico. He's a founding board member of the National Sheriff's Association Psychological Services Group, serves as the chair of the technology and social media, and regularly speaks to law enforcement audiences. Moderating today's presentation is Gordon Graham, a 33-year veteran of law enforcement and co-founder of Lexipol. He's a risk management expert and practicing attorney. Finally, the face that you don't see is Dr. John Scheinberg, who is in Texas and had to call in because of a lack of internet and power. He is a police lieutenant, chief medical officer at Sigma Tactical Health and Wellness, and president and CEO of the Public Safety Cardiac Foundation. Thank you all for attending, and take it away, Gordon.
Well, thanks very much, Crawford, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking time out of your schedule to watch this webinar. I know I've got a mixed group of people here, all sorts of different ranks, all sorts of different assignments from the 911 world, the cop world, the fire world, the EMS world, maybe some probation, maybe some custody people. And within those, all the various ranks, I guarantee you right up front that not every word we're going to say in the next 75 or so minutes is going to apply specifically to you. But hopefully, these three experts will be able to give you some strategies and tactics that you can take back to your respective workplace with the ultimate goal of really taking this wellness, the mental health, the physical wellness, the sleep deprivation, all these issues seriously. Let me kick it off with this. This is my 48th year in the business, and over the years, I've been to many different ceremonies where departments have bought a new building or built a new building or bought a new piece of equipment, or they've done something, and they have a meeting. And I hear these comments. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very proud of this new dispatch center. Ladies and gentlemen, this new piece of fire apparatus, this new tool, this will be of great benefit, but the greatest asset our organization has is not this building, is not the equipment we have. Our greatest asset is our people. I don't know if they teach that at chief school or superintendent school, but I hear this constantly. Our greatest asset is our chief people. Let me kick it off with this. Is it really? If our greatest asset is indeed our people, what are we doing for them? Seriously. Well, Gordon, 85% of our budget is pay, salary, and benefits. It's bigger. It's much bigger than pay, salary, and benefits. I got to remind you, if you don't know me, for my first 10 years as a lawyer, I did 2,000 police divorces. And I had these cops coming in my law office, and they were physical wrecks and mental wrecks. They're overweight, looking sick, not feeling well, depressed, some of them suicidal. We've got some problems lying in wait, not just in law enforcement, but throughout public safety. And it's an absolute honor to be with these three experts to talk about the physical issues, the mental issues, the sleep deprivation issues that are of concern to all of us. So I'll kick this off by asking Dr. Scheinberg this question. What do we really know about first responder health and wellness?
Well, Gordon, that was a tremendous introduction, and what we know, just like you said, it's a mess. And let me use an analogy here that will very much hold true. We use it in the law enforcement sector as a cardiologist and a cop. I live this world, but it also applies to our fire service. Likely applies to our 911 dispatchers as well as our corrections officers. However, those populations are just understudied. But what we have is an individual who graduates the academy. They're typically in their 20s. They have just finished a rigorous academy. They're physically in the best shape of their lives. They've undergone psychological screening, and some departments have a very thorough vetting. Other departments have less so, but it's safe to say that these individuals have at least had a very thorough physical and psychological analysis. So these people are in the best shape of their lives. And we take this tremendous natural resource, this young, healthy person, and over a career of about 20 years to 25 years, we basically destroy it. And what I mean by that is we give these individuals on the law enforcement side a life expectancy which is about 22 years less than general population. We give them heart attacks at a higher rate. We give them a higher propensity of obesity, which associates with hypertension and diabetes. We give them psychological issues. They have higher risks of divorce and suicide and substance abuse. And we take this individual, we physically and mentally ruin them, and then the average life expectancy of a law enforcement officer in the United States, according to some published data, is 57. So my take as we look at this problem is it is our duty and our responsibility in the executive leadership of every single department to make sure our officers go home safely at the end of their shift. And that doesn't just mean wearing reflective vests and pursuit policy and body armor compliance. It means taking an active role in keeping our officers fit and physically healthy and mentally healthy.
Thank you, Dr. Steinberg. If you were in charge, what would you be doing?
So I have the pleasure and the privilege of sitting on several different organizations on their officer safety and wellness side. And what we find is when you look at officer safety and wellness and you try to define it, it's typically defined by the individuals asking the question of what officer safety wellness is. If you look at a chaplaincy corps, they look at spiritual wellness. If you have a group of psychologists, they are often referring to wellness in terms of resiliency and mental strength. If you look at a physician group of wellness panel, we look at wellness as the absence of disease. However, every single wellness initiative really touches on 5 different things. And if I were in executive leadership, above the rank of lieutenant, I was at a department, there are 5 things that have to be looked at because this is where we come back, no matter who is hosting the conversation. The first one is tactical combat casualty care. I mean, officers and firefighters and EMS workers get injured, and they need to know how to provide self-aid and buddy aid. We've done a very good job in that regard. We have Stop the Bleed campaigns running, and almost every single officer, for example, has a belt-issue tourniquet and an individual first aid kit, which he or her is familiar with. The second is cardiac screening. Heart attacks are the #1 killer of men and women in law enforcement. And if you look at the officer, the ODMP, the memorial page, or you look at the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Fund, it's not listed as the #1 or 2 killer because that doesn't take into consideration deaths that occur off-duty hours, but when extrapolated for a 24-hour period, heart attack typically comes in as the #1 killer. So it's vital that we eliminate that. That's what we consider low-hanging fruit. It's easy to do, and we'll talk about how we do that later in the seminar. The third issue is dealing with nutritional issues because we do see a significant obesity rate in law enforcement, and we see it in the fire service. In the United States, if you look at some of the national data, about 48% of police officers are obese. If you look at Central Texas, where I'm located, over 81% of our officers are overweight and obese. The fourth column is fitness. Now, I separate with nutrition and fitness because they're 2 different areas, even though they overlap. Because an officer can be fit and overweight, and an officer can be of normal weight and not fit. So tactical combat casualty care, cardiac screening, nutrition, fitness, and of course the last large issue is mental health. And we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Black with us. He will expound on those issues. So those are the areas that officers and firefighters and our EMS brothers and sisters really have to take this at heart, and we have to develop plans to address every one of these issues.
Thank you, Doctor. So just to recap the top story, the TCCC, cardiac screening, nutrition and weight control, physical fitness, and mental health. Let me switch over to Dr. James for a second. How does sleep deprivation and fatigue play into all of this?
Thanks, Gordon. I mean, it's really, it's plays such an integral role. And I know as a sleep scientist, obviously everything looks sleep shaped to me. So that's usually my priority. But, you know, I mean, the other experts on this panel will certainly agree that it's so intertwined with risk of disease, with mental health problems, obviously with sleep disorders, with performance and safety issues. So it really is a critical component. And one of the big problems that we see in public safety is it's kind of the ignored component, right? You know, it's one of those things that compared to a population like elite athletes, it's really not prioritized, and it becomes normal, it becomes acceptable and just the way of life to be constantly tired. That's not normal. That's not a normal and acceptable way to live. So that's kind of where I come at this problem.
And how does shift work impact that?
Yeah, great question. You know, shift work, of course, is problematic because a large proportion of people are going to be working during times when their bodies want to be asleep, and they're going to be trying to sleep then when their bodies are saying, "Hey, it's time to wake up," and that's the kind of the concept of circadian misalignment, and why night shift work, it can be so problematic. But it's not just night shift, you know, I mean, a lot of day shift guys and girls can really struggle as well, especially if they have a little bit more of a tendency to be night owls, a little bit more tendency to be evening people, and they're having to wake up extremely early. So although, you know, we often focus on the night shift in terms of some of these problems, and we do see, you know, some performance and safety issues that are certainly amplified in night shift workers. You know, shift work is problematic just in general. Part of that is the long work hours as well. And then of course the potential for overtime that really exacerbates that.
One of the common tales that you hear in law enforcement is that a person who's been up for 24 hours has an equivalent of a blood alcohol level of, and I've always wondered, is there any truth to that? Certainly a chief of police would never allow a cop to go out under the influence of alcohol, but the sleep somehow falls between the cracks here.
Exactly. And I think, you know, I honestly believe that we will get to a point, some point in the future, where just like it used to be acceptable to show up to work with a few beers under your belt, it will get to a point where it will no longer be acceptable to come to work under the same kinds of, you know, fatigued states. And you're absolutely right. 24 hours awake is the same as blowing a 0.1. So, you know, kind of over the legal limit. And not to be alarmist, but drowsy driving in some ways is actually more dangerous than drunk driving. And what I mean by that is drunk driving, although of course extremely problematic, is at least predictable. It's at least linear, right? So what I mean is if you have a drink, your performance is impaired by a predictable amount, and that increases as you have more and more alcohol. Sleep restriction and fatigue that results from it doesn't really work the same. You're fine, you're fine, you're fine, you're asleep, right? And it's not predictable. And it's very difficult to control when that will happen. And part of the other problem with drowsy driving is that oftentimes it's kind of a reinforcing behavior because we get away with it all the time. And I'm sure that everybody who's listening has had that experience of driving and you nod off just for a second, and because there's no bend in the road, because there's no obstacle, because there's no hazard, you're fine and you think, okay, I can just push through, I can just get home. But what happens if you have one of those lapses while a kid runs across the street? You know, I mean, nothing is worth that. Nothing is worth that risk. And yet it is something that, despite law enforcement and other public safety personnel knowing is very important, it's still, we're not quite there yet.
You know, as I watch some of the major events in the news nationally today where law enforcement has not performed up to its best level, I've often asked the question, what were they thinking? Does fatigue play a role in that? When you look at these things, you're saying, I wonder if you were asking this question, I wonder how much sleep this person has had in the last 4 or 5 days. Has that ever popped into your head?
I would argue that it plays one of the most important roles. Fatigue and stress, and you know, a lot of my work, of course, is with implicit bias and implicit bias training. I would argue that fatigue management and stress management is probably, you know, certainly as important, because officers don't make bad decisions when they're well rested and when they're not stressed and they're in their, you know, perfect rational states. Where they do make mistakes, and this is not just limited to police officers, it's across multiple professions. Where we do make mistakes is when we're tired, when we're not thinking straight, when we're flooded with sympathetic response, for example. And yeah, so every time an incident pops up, my first question is often, well, you know, how long had the officer been on shift? You know, what kind of mental state were they operating under?
I don't want to beat this to death, but you know, when a big rig runs off the road and hits a firefighter or hits a cop and kills them, and sadly we've had some of these roadway incursions recently, the investigators take that truck driver's life apart. They get all the cell phone records, all the movie rental records, all the credit card records, all the transponder records, and then someone from the agency throws a news conference and says, the proximate cause of this tragedy was run off road. The real problem lying in wait, though, was a fatigued truck driver, and we're going to look at new laws and new regulations. I see why we do that. Sadly, though, when a cop runs off the road or a firefighter makes a turn too hard and flips an apparatus, or a dispatcher falls asleep at the console and this is an important call, we don't do that same type of analysis. Bad things are just going to happen and there's nothing we can do about it. Can you comment on that?
Again, I think it goes back to that notion that it's just, you know, part of it is the culture. It's just expected. It's normal, you know. And people think it's just the way that it is. And if you can't cope with only 4 hours sleep a night, if you can't cope with being exhausted all the time, then you're weak and you're not cut out for these jobs. Which for me is really, really problematic. And again, going back to athletes, which is a group that I work with that take almost a completely opposite approach. You know, I mean, they're looking for anything that will take them from, you know, from good to great, or from great to gold medal winning. So, you know, I mean, the thing that we really need to do and we really need to shift is, yeah, maybe you can get by. Maybe you can get by on 4 hours sleep at about 70% of your cognitive capacity at a very, very increased risk of accident and error and illness. But is public safety a 70% profession? Is that what we expect from these people? I would argue it's a 100% profession, you know, and so that's I think where we really need to make that shift. And I am very hopeful that it's happening, or we wouldn't be having webinars like this.
Good. Well, thanks, Dr. James, and also Dr. Steinberg, for your thoughts on the physical issues. Dr. Black, I see you sitting there. Let's talk about the whole mental health issue and the emotional health. Why is that so critical for first responders?
Well, it's absolutely critical. Here's what we've got. We've got the toughest people in the United States. We've got the strongest, most resilient, most courageous people who sign up to be law enforcement. And as Dr. Steinberg pointed out, they're psychologically screened. They're medically screened. They're screened by the departments. So they come in specimens of physical and mental health and resilience. And what happens is then they're surrounded by a culture of strength, because you're surrounded by coworkers who are cut from the same cloth to some extent. And this has this double-edged sword, because it creates this culture of stigma for seeking help. And we know from great work done by Sherry Martin, the National FOP, 90% of law enforcement, 80% of firefighters also report that there's a stigma that would keep them from getting help for mental or emotional issues. And when you drill down and you say, well, why is that the case? It's because I don't want to appear weak. I don't want to lose my job. And even if I reached out, would anyone know how to help me? So here's the thing. Your resilience can kill you. Your resilience can kill you. Because if you weren't so resilient, you never would have been able to go on this job to begin with. You wouldn't have been able to handle it for more than a week. I always say the average person on the street would never, ever volunteer to put on body armor, carry a sidearm, run towards shots fired. These are special, tough, resilient people that do that. However, your average law enforcement officer, for example, is exposed to 188 critical incidents over the course of their career. Take a moment to absorb that. 188 incidents that by definition overwhelm normal coping skills and resources. Now, your average person, I would argue, encounters maybe 5 or 10 of those during their lifetime. So here's we got the toughest of the tough, the most courageous, and we're asking them to endure 188 critical incidents over the course of their career. Well, because of their resilience, they'll continue to take that on. They'll continue to absorb that, often until the time that they're at a breaking point. Here's what we know. The vast majority of law enforcement, for example, report that stressful experiences on the job have caused unresolved emotional issues. So this is not being addressed. We also know when we talk about this big problem we have with first responders, it's really been highlighted in law enforcement through organizations like the IACP, Blue Help, Karen Solomon, the great work being done there. Suicidal ideation for first responders, we know it's tied to both post-traumatic stress and depression. So when you talk about exposure to 188 critical incidents over the course of your career, you're going to develop greater and greater risk for post-traumatic stress. This is why we often call it the death by 1,000 cuts. It's cumulative, it builds up over time. There's often one incident that pushes it to the forefront, but it's a lot of stuff that's built up over time. Let's talk a moment about depression. We don't talk about enough about depression in our first responders. Recent research done by some great psychologists working with the U.S. Marshal Service, they found that in the first 5 years of your work as a law enforcement officer, you see a doubling of depression rates. Think about that, a doubling of depression rates in the first 5 years when you sign up to be a law enforcement officer. Depression then becomes the #1 symptom reported by first responders that's associated with risk of suicidal thoughts. We look at rates of suicidal thoughts in our first responders, much, much higher than the general population. Again, keep in mind, general population not psychologically screened, general population not as tough and resilient as first responders. So why should their suicidal thoughts be anything close to general population, let alone well over twice what we see in the general population in a given year? One thing we get asked is, well, what red flags should I be looking out for? You know, amongst my coworkers, maybe for myself, what are the big red flags to look out for? Pay attention to depression, pay attention to suicidal thoughts, thinking of hopelessness, helplessness. But there's this is very recent research that was released in an IACP presentation. They found there's a cluster of 5 symptoms for law enforcement that what you do is you see a 14x increased risk for suicidal thoughts. And these are all normal symptoms to have in response to trauma. You got #1, shutting down or feeling withdrawn. So that pulling back, that by itself is about a 5x plus increased risk of suicidal thoughts. 2, lack of sleep, which Dr. James was talking all about that. The vast majority of police, we know, do not get anything close to sufficient sleep on their work nights. So at least 75% or so get 6 hours or less of sleep on their work nights. 3, avoiding reminders of critical events, right? Classic PTSD symptom. 4, flashbacks or nightmares. Classic PTSD symptom. And last, feeling hypervigilant or overly watchful. When you have those 5 symptoms, again, normal reactions to trauma that cluster with post-traumatic stress symptoms, you have a 14x increased risk for suicidal ideation. So if we care about first responders, if you're a first responder yourself, you care about your brothers and sisters, you care about your own life, if you're a spouse, a first responder, if you're human resources or risk management, or like me, a professional who's entirely devoted to caring for them, this has to be at the forefront of our thinking. This is critically important. The one last point I'll make here is that all of these symptoms and all this very, very high level of stress, and when you do rankings of the most stressful jobs in the United States, we know most people are out there saying, oh, I have such a stressful job, and they probably do. But you know what's at the very, very top of that list? There's 3 jobs at the very, very top of that list: active duty military, law enforcement, and fire. Right at the very top of the most stressful job. And when you look at how does stress impact a person's ability to cope? Well, what we often see is it pushes you into an unhealthy lifestyle. Why? Because you're in a position where you're having to react. You don't have time, you're sleep deprived, you're under tremendous stress and pressure. And what that leads to is that lack of sleep. It leads to reliance on junk food, overeating, alcohol, pulling back and isolating. What our good friend Dr. Kevin Gill-Martin on the Cortical Advisory Board often talks about, singular identity. Because what happens is job takes so much of your energy, and that little reserve you have left, you wind up investing it in the job. Why? The job makes you feel alive. It makes you feel alert. It makes you feel engaged, respond to all these intense situations. It's a shot of adrenaline, and you're out there making a difference in the world. You're serving, you're protecting, you're saving lives. That feels fantastic when it's going right. But what it does, it doesn't leave you with much at the end of the day when you get home. And we see a lot of our first responders, they're collapsing, they're exhausted, they have no more emotional energy or reserves to put in their life outside of work. And so over the course of the career, you see more and more of this shifting of emotional energy and identity into the career. Unfortunately, what happens, that sets you up for long-term problems because you become so dependent on that career for how you see yourself in the world, and you have less and less structure outside of that career to support you. So that's just a quick overview of some of the reasons why mental health, resilience, and emotional health are so important for our first responders.
Let me throw this in, Dr. Black. The 188 incidents you referred, that's the time on the street.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just the odd duck here, but when I was active, I had a lot of stress in the first 30 minutes and the last 30 minutes of the shift, dealing with bosses who never said thank you, never complimented you on your work. I believe in that fulfillment component, knowing you're making a difference. But when do bosses have anything here they can do to reduce this problem in law enforcement and the fire service? Are there behaviors they can participate in to make things better?
Great question. If you're a chief, if you're command staff, or if you're an informal leader of any kind in your department, here's what I want you to understand. Come back to the stigma. Understand that this job is going to put immense stress on your people over time. You know that yourself by virtue of your own history in the career. Now, often if you've gotten to the chief level, you've been exposed to a lot more of that, and you've been able to survive that to some degree of effectiveness by virtue of the fact that you've gotten to the chief profession. So be sure to empathize with people, understand what they're going through, know that this is going to stack up, it's going to affect different people in different ways at different times. Understand that the health and wellness of your people is your direct responsibility. When you're a chief, when you're a sheriff, when you're command staff, that's your direct responsibility. So I think taking some ownership and then appreciating that there is this pervasive stigma that keep people from getting help for mental and emotional issues. Here's some interesting stats. So National FOP, they surveyed more than 8,000 law enforcement. They found that the vast majority, more than 80%, are aware of behavioral health services provided by their employers. So that's great news, right? Here's the other side of that. Barely 20% have used those services. So almost everyone's aware of these services, but almost no one's using them. And now here's the real tragic. So of that barely 20% that uses them, more than half that utilize their EAP, come back and say, not helpful. That is an unacceptable statistic. When we say, okay, as a city, for example, we are going to outsource our societies, our communities' trauma to this group of heroes, and they, without question, they're going to run around and respond to everyone else's worst case scenario. When no one else can solve the problem, when it's life and death, they're going to be on the front lines. But then we look at what has been provided for these heroes on the back end when they get to the position where they finally are asking for help. And again, they've often put that off very far, and we're failing more than half the time with the EAP. So that's really unacceptable. Fortunately, there's lots of things that can be done. Think about your agency culture, right? Make it okay to not be okay. If you've got a minute, open up your Google search engine, type in Chief Neil Gang Asher Model. Chief Neil Gang Asher Model, ASHER. And you'll see a great example of a chief who's found a way to transform agency culture, and he is very generous and lets other agencies use this model. It's one model, but I think it's fantastic. It's gotten a lot of attention. Think about all the stakeholders involved. It's not just up to chiefs and command staff. One great thing about wellness is it unites everyone, right? How do you stand against wellness for your people, right? So this unites chiefs and command staff with the union and association. If there's one place that your command and your association can come together and agree, it's got to be that wellness is the top priority. The front lines who are exposed to this every day, the spouses, significant others, the risk managers, HR, everybody needs to unite and support this. This is the one issue. Leaders are sometimes the top source of stress in a department. So do more to care for your people, embrace that their wellness is your responsibility. And I'll also make a plug here for peer support. Peer support, critically important. We've got Corporal Ken Hardesty, for example, Davis Police Department, outstanding example of what you can do leading a peer support team to make a real difference in a department. And I could give examples nationwide. Peer support are about my favorite people out there because not only are they first responders, but they've gone above and beyond to say, brothers and sisters in the department, at your worst time, when you're at greatest need, I'll be here for you. So really, if you have a peer support team, invest in them, support them, make them prominent, make them accessible. If you don't have a peer support team, that should be a high priority. Be prepared. Understand there's a wide range of issues that come up when we're talking about mental and emotional health. And it's very different if someone's having suicidal thoughts, which again, quite common amongst our first responders. So we need to be prepared for that. But it's very different if you're dealing with marriage issues or parenting issues or alcohol and substance abuse, anger issues, intrusive images pop into your mind from like working on an ICAC task force, for example. So we need to have tools, solutions, resources that address all these different issues, make them confidential so that you can access them without any stigma or concern, make them 24/7 availability. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is vetted therapists, if we have a minute for that.
Please.
Yeah, so the issue here is a lot of therapists, and I don't want to discourage anyone from seeking help from a therapist, but be prepared that therapists are often very, very different from first responders, right? And we need to do a lot more work vetting therapists nationwide. We're doing this work with National FOP, we're doing work with IECP on this, but it's critical that we have the best of the best out there for our first responders who know how to support them. And what we look for are vetted therapists who are very, very culturally competent. They understand the work that law enforcement, fire, dispatchers, corrections do. So it's not the job of the patient to come in and educate the therapist. The therapist is an expert, understands those cultures. They need to really know what they're doing in terms of assessment and treatment, use empirically validated therapies, have the right sort of assertive, confident personality to get in there and provide help. Dr. Stephanie Kahn's been doing great work on this with FOP. And then they need to be available 24/7. A lot of these therapists, you know, they have very limited availability, and I really find that unacceptable. You got to prioritize getting the first responders in, and then you have to find therapists that understand the issues about confidentiality and not breaching confidentiality and being very, very discreet. So those are just some of the different solutions we have at our disposal.
Gosh, my brain's going 150 miles an hour listening to all this, Dr. Black. You know, Dr. Steinberg's in Texas, and one of my most respected people that I have had the honor to meet is Dr. Michael DeBakey. Everything the world knows about heart surgery, open heart surgery, fetal heart surgery, complex heart surgery, all of it started in East Texas with Dr. DeBakey. And, you know, he ended up being Doctor of the Year on Time Magazine. And I guess the Shah of Iran was watching Time or reading Time Magazine, and the Shah had a liver problem, and he wanted the Doctor of the Year to do his liver surgery. When heart surgeons start doing liver surgery, that's a problem lying in wait. When a generalist therapist tries to get into the complex world of law enforcement, fire service, public safety operations, I sense that's a problem lying in wait. So your point about finding a therapist that really understands public safety personnel is absolutely critical. So I was fascinated with what Dr. James said about the fatigue issues and what you said about the mental health issues. So I'll switch over to Dr. Steinberg now. How does this impact heart health, the fatigue and the mental health? Does it? And if it does, what can we do? Can we do something proactively to address this?
The answer across the board is yes and yes. So let me dive a little bit here into the physiology, which is something that you have to understand before we understand the solution. So we have a stressful job in law enforcement. There's no question. I will argue that I will speak to dozens of patients a day, civilian and law enforcement, and everybody's stressed out across the board. So the stress levels are high everywhere. Everyone's kids are with the pandemic, and everyone's got financial issues. But what we have in the public safety sector is a very different pattern of stress. If you're not a law enforcement officer or a firefighter or an EMS worker, you don't realize that being a cop is a pretty sedentary, boring job. We sit around. I mean, there's a lot of time that nothing goes on, but it's punctuated by bits of adrenaline dump, and what we describe it as 98% boredom and 2% sheer terror. And when that sheer terror moment happens, and it can happen during a hands-on event, it can happen during a pursuit, it can happen doing CPR on a person, it can happen providing medical care at a collision site. Several things kick off physiologically. There's a rapid increase in heart rate and blood pressure. There's an immediate conversion from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism. You have repeated Valsalva maneuver, where you're constantly bearing down. In fact, this really comes out to play in training scenarios where the defensive tactics instructor is always, reminding the participant to breathe, because we forget to breathe. You end up using both the left and right hemispheres of the brain in your upper and lower body to mitigate whatever threat that you are currently dealing with. And this rapid release of adrenaline, which causes that physiological response, has been implicated in the increased risk of heart attack. So a heart attack is not everyone knows that a heart attack is a blocked artery. It's rather common knowledge, but it's not an artery that gradually narrows. What happens is there's some plaque in the artery. Over time, that plaque, which builds in the artery wall, not in the opening of the artery like scale would in a pipe, but this plaque in the wall of the artery becomes inflamed and eventually becomes so highly inflamed that it bursts. That causes a clot to form, and that's what a heart attack is. And this response is thought to encourage that plaque to burst or rupture. And very interestingly, it doesn't happen at the time of the event. Most often it happens hours later. It's akin to people who live in the north who we see this increase in heart attacks after people get out there and shovel snow. They don't drop over while they're shoveling the snow. They're shoveling the snow, they go inside, and their heart attack happens an hour or two later. So these heart attacks often originate in the line of duty, but don't present until after that individual has gotten off their shift. So that's the physiology. So how do you handle this? Well, all the fields that we're hearing today all interplay, because you have to be fit physically, you have to be mentally fit, and you have to have enough sleep so your performance is not impaired. From a medical standpoint, there are certain things that we can specifically look for to identify those people who have plaque, which is vulnerable to this rupture. So we can look at a population of people and we can identify those people years before that plaque ruptures. And you made the reference to Dr. DeBakey, and I will first say I am no Dr. DeBakey, but we don't want to get to that point. We have the knowledge and the technology that if someone ends up in the emergency department with chest pain from a blockage, has a heart attack or needs a stent or a bypass, we failed those people because we can pick this stuff up years before that happens. And basically what we do is we look for markers that can identify the presence of this plaque years before that plaque ruptures. And there's two markers in particular. And those of you who are following along, if you look at the downloaded material, it's going to be listed in the downloaded material, but I'm going to talk about them briefly. One marker can be identified as what's called a calcium score. So it's a very fast, low-dose radiation CT scan of the chest. A CT scan, you literally lie down on the scanner and you go in and out in about 30 seconds. And the scanner the scan typically costs between $75 and $150. And the scan is able to identify little flecks of calcium within the walls of the artery, which indicate that there's plaque present. Now that test is very good, but it needs to be accompanied with another test. There's a blood test that can look for markers of inflammation in the blood. Now this is different than the inflammation that someone would get if they have arthritis of the knee or ulcerative colitis or an infection. There are specific markers in the blood that elevate if plaque is forming and at risk of rupturing. And the marker that has been studied the best is a marker which is called phospholipase A2, but it's abbreviated as LP, so that's Lima Papa dash P as in Papa, L as in Lima, A as in Alpha, and the number 2, LPPLA2. This marker is highly sensitive for the identification of plaque, which is vulnerable to rupture. We've published, we're in the process of publishing data on about 5,000 officers who've undergone this screening. And what we found is there is a little overlap. So most officers will either have, or most people that we identify as having abnormalities will have one or the other, an elevation of calcium or an elevation of this inflammatory marker. So it's vital that we look at both of them. These are tests that can be done by any laboratory or physician in a decent size medical facility or population. It's in the more rural areas, it's harder. But I'm often asked when we travel and we present this information, well, how do I get this? Do I just go ask my doctor for this? And is this something that you can just order? And this comes down to the simple fact that I give this advice to just about every patient and every time I speak, as not only as public safety workers, but as patients. You have to advocate for yourself. If you have a physician, for example, who is not reminding you to get colonoscopies, you have an obligation to ask that physician, hey, shouldn't I be getting a colonoscopy? I'm 50. Shouldn't I, something I should be needing to do? Or I haven't had a mammogram. I haven't had mammography in a while. Is that something I should be doing? This is just as vital. So what I would recommend is ask your personal physicians if they have the ability to offer this type of testing. If not, ask for someone who's able to do it. There are different ways of getting this done throughout the United States. There's different places, and this is something that can be advocated for by the individual. I work as a chief medical officer for a company called Sigma Tactical Wellness. Sigma is in the Greek letter Sigma. Sigma is a company that has pioneered and has some of the proprietary testing in this, and we do it at local agencies throughout the country, but it can be also requested and done by the individuals. And I would ask everyone, and I hate to use this word, to be empowered to sort of be their own advocate and get this testing done. So Gordon, I took your question and I kind of ran with it, but the answer sort of simply is this is detectable, and if it's detected, it's treatable. There is a definitive blend between the psychological forces at play and the physiological forces, and it has to be a multidisciplined approach.
Wow. Thank you, Doctor. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're pointing out problems and solutions. And Dr. Black talked about the problem and some of the solutions regarding mental health. I just listened to Dr. Scheinberg there, was utterly fascinated with pointing out the problems as he did and the solutions. Dr. James, I'd like to switch over to you regarding the fatigue issues. I know that you focused on this early on in your career, and you continue to focus on this. If you were in charge, if you were running an agency, or if you had control, what are the three things you would do to address this huge issue of fatigue in public safety?
Right. I think there are three things that are really, really important. And I have people all the time who kind of say to me, there's no way this problem can be fixed, right? I mean, you can't create more hours in a day, I can only do what I can with the hours that I have, and so on and so forth. But there really are three things. The first is everybody needs to make the most of the sleep opportunity they have. Even if that sleep opportunity is not long enough, there's certain critical things that they can do. I'll come back to that in a minute. The second one is actually create new sleep opportunities. And this is something that can be the responsibility of an organization, and also it can be the responsibility of an employee or an individual. I'll come back to that as well. And then the third one, which is, although it's the one that gets talked about the most, is probably the least high in terms of priority for me, is to mitigate fatigue when you are awake and when you are at work. But to go back, so the first one, this is the concept of sleep hygiene, right? And that's a term that gets thrown around a lot. And really all that means is you're creating the best possible environment and conditions to make the most of your sleep opportunity. So these are things like when you go down to bed, you need to make sure that your room is cool, that the temperature is cool, a good 3 or 4 degrees cooler than you would want it during your waking hours. You need to make sure that your sleep environment is dark, right? Shift work aside, I know this can be challenging. Everybody who works shifts needs to have a good pair of blackout blinds, for example. You need to make sure that your sleep environment is quiet. I know kids, dogs, family, that can be challenging. There are ways around it. Play around with different types of earbuds, for example. There will be something that works. Minimizing technology, and I hate to sound like everybody's mother, but this is something that's really, really important. If you're waking up in the middle of your sleep period and you're going on your phone and you're scrolling through social media, you are really, really damaging your ability to fall back to sleep. So just don't, just prioritize feeling well over other things. I'm sure there are more in there, but in the interest of time, I'll jump to the second piece, which is creating new opportunities, creating additional opportunities for sleep. This is the concept of napping, right? And one thing that I would do if I ruled the world and was in charge of everything is I would mandate napping. And I think that on-duty napping is the way of the future. I know there is still huge resistance to it, but I fully believe that there will come a point where, much like it has in other professional groups, it will be completely acceptable and expected to nap while on duty. There are a couple of things to consider with napping. One is duration, and I mean, I'm going to move away from on-duty napping. So let's say you're napping when you're at home. Duration is a really important one, because what you really want to do is avoid that grogginess of waking from a nap, which is called sleep inertia, which is that feeling I'm sure everybody has felt of being dragged up from the depths of hell, and you think that no job ever is worth feeling like that. So you really want to avoid that, and the way you avoid it is by having a nap that's either 20 minutes long or 90 minutes long. And I'm not going to go into the science in too much detail now, but really what that will do is it'll minimize your chances of being woken up from slow wave sleep or from really deep sleep, which is where you get that grogginess. And then the third one, which is the fatigue countermeasures. These are things that people know a little bit more, use of caffeine, for example. Hydration is a great one. If you're tired, have a glass of water. Fatigue and dehydration are very tightly connected. Using exercise to give your body temperature a boost can give you a kind of a burst of alertness. Using light therapy is becoming increasingly popular. Seasonal affective disorder light boxes are something that can be very effective for use in shifts. And in the medical profession, for example, at nursing stations, it's becoming quite common to see light boxes at a nurse's station where, in the middle of the night during that kind of 2 to 4 a.m. period, where that's going to be, for the vast majority of us anyway, that's going to be the worst point to give yourself a boost during that time. So those are kind of the big high level ones. There are plenty of others. And the great thing is they're all fairly straightforward. We've spent quite a lot of time now talking about the doom and gloom of first responders and how awful it can be. And it certainly can. But there are solutions, and they're not all rocket science. There are some things that can be done that are quite straightforward. We just don't think about them.
When you mention the napping, the question I get often from executives, how am I going to justify that financially? How am I going to justify my people are sleeping on duty? And my response is, when I served as a consultant back in the 80s and 90s, going into agencies and looking at workers' comp claims, and I'll ask all the executives who are watching this today, are you more likely to get hurt in the first half of the shift or the second half of the shift? And I'm sure somebody out there has collected this data and looked at it, but my experience tells me that you are much more likely to be hurt in the second half of the shift. It's the same job throughout the 8 to 12 or 10 or 12 hours or 24 hours, yet for some reason we get hurt more. I am absolutely convinced, and tell me if I'm headed in the right direction here, that we can reduce substantially workers' comp costs if we afforded people a nap during the middle of the shift. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. It really does. And we talk about fatigue countermeasures, and the vast majority of them are temporary, right? They're band-aids. You're just slapping a band-aid on a problem, knowing that it'll help a little bit, but it won't actually solve the problem. The only thing that solves the problem of fatigue is sleep. That is why napping is by far and away the best and the most effective fatigue countermeasure. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And granted, there are some departments, of course, that are extremely busy where it will be a logistical challenge to figure this out. But departments are starting to do this, around the country, departments are starting to do this. And, I mean, if you're an executive and you think really critically about the shifts that people are on, likely there is a quiet time during that shift, especially during graves. I mean, bad guys and girls tend to have circadian rhythms too, and do also take some time off at some points. So, I mean, there is a way to figure it out.
one of my favorite authors. I switch off between books where I can learn something and books that I enjoy. One of my favorite enjoyable authors is David Hagberg, and his protagonist is Kirk McGarvey. And in every Kirk McGarvey book, you'll hear this expression: "Sleep is a weapon. Sleep is a weapon." And I've often thought that, being able to get that nap, take that brief period of rest, that will sharpen your skills and actually better protect you on duty. Dr. Scheinberg, I'm going back over to you here for a second. These issues of sleep, are they related to the heart attack issues also?
So absolutely, it's all interrelated. Sleep, we do see higher risks of coronary disease in people who have sleep deprivation, but it's related to sleep, but it's also related to overall fatigue and overall mental health. So let me set a scenario so I can talk about it more specifically. You have an officer, for example, who's working 10-hour shifts and they're busy and maybe they're on night shift and they're not sleeping well during the day. So what happens to that individual? Well, that individual is now carbohydrate and caffeine dependent. So they're in the cruiser, they're in the patrol vehicle, and they're drinking Monster energy drinks, or they're pounding Red Bulls to stay awake. This huge amount of carbohydrate and sugar, this junk food, also perpetuates a huge increase in insulin, which makes people more tired and more carbohydrate and sugar dependent. This cycle is difficult to break. It's the same phenomena that was really made popular in that movie Super Size Me, where you have an incredible amount of fatigue and then you get a load of carbohydrates and sugar and you wake up. Those types of foods are highly detrimental to a cardiovascular physiology, and that also contributes to the associated problems of hypertension, obesity, and diabetes. So everything that we're discussing today is intimately interwoven. There's no way to isolate one problem until you bring in the expertise of my other colleagues that are on this call with us today. One of the ways around that is following the guidance that we have just talked about with the sleep, but also what I also recommend to our officers is they prepare. It is very easy to bring healthy food with you. Pack a lunch, pack a dinner, bring protein-laden foods. Don't have a shift with no food plan. And what ends up happening is you get over hungry, tired, and you hit the drive-through. And you'll grab a burger, fries, and a Coke in between calls, when it's much better to have a lunchbox packed with some healthy proteins, nuts, cheeses, fruit. And if that is eaten throughout the shift, we can avoid those late night runs. I mean, everything in moderation. A cup of coffee, caffeine is useful. We know in performance, caffeine helps, but over-reliance is not healthy, especially over-reliance in what we see as the proliferation of energy drinks. I can't tell you how many patrol cars, after they're not properly cleaned out when I get into them, there's energy drinks everywhere. And this is a problem. So in order to make sure that we have active and healthy individuals, we also have to have pre-planning. So I would urge everyone out there, if your department doesn't have, and most departments don't have a way for you to get healthy meals, bring your own stuff. Pack a lunch, pack dinner, pack snacks. It will go a tremendously long way in keeping people alert and healthy.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Black, I want to switch back to you for a second. And one thing that troubled me about some of your comments was the stigma that it's okay to go in with a broken bone, but to say that my head has a problem, people don't like that. And I don't want to talk about it. That's too personal for me. Let me start off with this. I had a dear friend that I worked with very closely who 5 times pulled over people who made a conscious decision: I'm going to kill this cop today. And I'm talking about 5 knockdown, drag out shootouts on the right shoulder. Not I thought he was going for a gun, not he looked suspicious. Knockdown, drag out shootouts. And my department at the time did not mandate the mental health counseling after a combat shooting, but he always chose to go to that. And he was highly respected in the department, but he always chose to go to that. And I asked him, why do you choose to go to that? And his response was actually pretty funny. He says, number one, it's on overtime. And number two, I want everybody to know it's okay to seek help after one of these events. That to me was very advanced thinking, and it did not surprise me because the guy was a deep thinker. Does that help eliminate that stigma? And what else can we do to eliminate the stigma where people are hesitant to go talk about this?
Yeah, great question, great point, Scorin. There's so much we can do. You think about it, the stigma is under our direct control. I want everyone to take that away. This is something that we can all take down working together. One thing that's really helpful is when you do have leaders or people who are highly respected or visible, or anyone in the department almost, who has a story to share about, here's what I've been through, here's how I dealt with it, here was the good outcome from that. That takes a lot of courage to do that. But when you're able to do that, people hear, people learn from those stories, and it sets an example for here's a good way to handle it that has a positive ending. We want people getting in early and earlier. I don't want the nation's heroes waiting until they're about to break. I want them getting in as early as possible and getting help with before too much suffering occurs. Another thing we can do is integrate mental and physical health resources together. I really strongly believe this. It's a false dichotomy to say, well, we've got mental health here and we've got physical health here. If you think about it, sleep, and Dr. James has been doing a great job explaining about how sleep impacts first responders and what we can do about it. Well, sleep impacts your physical health, it impacts your mental health. Alcohol, for example, impacts your physical health, impacts your mental health. Exercise, we think of, well, I do exercise for my physical health. Did you know that exercise is an effective treatment for mild to moderate depression? And that, again, depression's our #1 risk factor reported by first responders as risk factor for suicidal thoughts. So these things are all intertwined. The more that we blend in the physical health resources with the mental health resources, the more that we normalize and destigmatize mental health utilization. The other thing is, again, get all these stakeholders involved. We need the chiefs, the command staffs, the sheriffs, we need them all speaking out about this, normalizing it. There's this great thing, we've got all these chiefs and sheriffs in our apps on video saying, use these resources. This is a stressful job. This is here for you. I encourage you to seek help. We've brought this here for you. That's a wonderful thing when I see leaders doing that, putting their name behind it, taking that stance. That's very powerful. The other thing, peer support. When you have a peer support team in place that normalize it, that's able to take the barometer of the organization, they know everyone there, they're able to see when people are struggling and reach out and intervene, that goes a long, long way too. But if there was one principle, I would say it's provide high quality access to confidential resources 24/7. That's what it comes down to. You got to have quality because otherwise people won't go back and use it and you'll miss opportunities, which is unacceptable. You got to make it confidential so you get past the stigma with that. I don't have to worry about using those resources and make them available whenever someone needs them. If you're doing all those things, what you see is the stakeholders come on board, you get all this support, and it starts to transform organizations and the culture.
Thank you. You know, we've talked about the firefighters and cops and paramedics and the people who work the street, but I want to throw this in to your thinking, Dr. Black. I had a lady friend who was a 911 operator in a very small center where she was the only person on duty, and multiple calls came in about a shooting in a courthouse. And she was taking calls in and putting calls out and all the things that she had to do. She was very busy for a good half an hour, solid, nonstop performance, calls in, calls out, trying to get things squared away. Finally, it's all over. The situation is back to, well, I don't want to use the word normal, but it's over. And she sees an email that there'll be a peer support meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So she calls and she says, where is this meeting? Well, it's only for the people who were on scene. Can you comment on that? Was she on scene?
Yeah, she absolutely was. And, you know, that's the thing. Our dispatchers often get pushed aside and forgotten, and that's really unacceptable. Oftentimes, they absorb this in a way that no one else does because they're on the literal front lines of the call coming in, dispatching people. They often have close relationships and care very much about, and then not knowing how it went for them. So that's one reason why when we provide resources, we always say, this is for all your personnel, not just your sworn, for example. This is for all the personnel. It's for the spouses also, because the spouses also feel this. The spouses are literally there when the armor comes off at the end of every shift, right? Literally and figuratively, when the armor comes off, they're on the front lines. And then the retirees as well. There's all these people that they're both stakeholders in the wellness of the first responders, but they're also directly impacted by it. And so can't leave anyone out. Absolutely not.
Thank you. Well, I see we're closing in on the hour mark, and I wanted to leave some time at the end for some closing comments from each of you. Dr. James, one big point that if they don't get anything else out of your comments, what would you want people to leave with today?
I would say just make a commitment, or even the start of a commitment, that you will start to prioritize sleep, or at the very least not push it to the side, not have the kind of the I'll sleep when I'm dead mentality. Just think about, you know it's important. You've heard just how important today, how it's connected to mental health, to physical health, to lifespan. Just commit to starting to make a change.
Thank you. Dr. Steinberg, one takeaway on the heart issue. What can we do if you were talking to people as you have today? What do you want them to leave with? The one thought.
Well, it's a two-part answer to your question. The first is, remember that heart attacks are one of the number one contributors to the fact that as law enforcement officers, the average age of death is 57 years of age, and it doesn't have to be that way. We have the ability to identify the early stages of blockage formation. We have which are those two tests, which I'm sure we'll mention here again in just a minute, so everyone has a moment to write those down. But also, you got to take care of yourselves. You've got to find the right nutritional program that's going to work. You've got to find the right fitness program that's going to work. You've got to take care of your mental health. You got to take care of your sleep hygiene and your sleep health, because we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to those who work for us to make sure that our officers not only get home at the end of the shift, but live a long, healthy life and enjoy the retirement that they work so hard and sacrifice so much for.
Thank you. Dr. Black, same question.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't talked about this yet, but I think this is the most important takeaway that I could offer. Understand that there's a lot of things in the world that you care about. There's a lot of things that trouble you, that worry you, that you wish were different. Within that, there's a much smaller circle or sphere of things that you can directly positively impact. We call that your circle of control. Focus on that, leave everything else out. The more that you can focus on what you can directly positively impact every single day through your own actions, behaviors, thoughts, that's where you want to focus all your time, effort, energy, and attention. There's only so many precious hours, minutes, seconds in a day. Put it all into those things that you can control and impact. And within that, find whatever you can do every single day to prioritize your own health and wellness. Understand this is a very stressful job. So it could be, I'm going to prioritize my sleep. I'm going to improve my diet. I'm going to try to just take better care of myself in general. I'm going to start an exercise routine. That's all under your direct control. Choose something every single day. And then as much as possible, try to let go of all these things that you cannot directly control yourself.
Thank you. And my one takeaway is for all the executives watching this today, please, you can get the recording, take a look at it, and ask yourself this question: what can I do as a leader in my fire department, my police department, my dispatch center? What can I do to really maximize not just the length of life, but the quality of life of our personnel? I want to wrap up with this. About a decade ago, I got introduced to a book called Blue Zones. There's 5 areas of the world where people regularly live to being over 100 years old and healthy at 100 years old. And that led me to read a number of other books on length of life and quality of life. And I put together a program called My 10 Fs. And if you want this, I'll make sure it's available to you. My 10 Fs. Occasionally, I'll show up as an attendee at a conference and someone will say, hey, there's Gordon Graham. Gordon, would you like to say a couple words? I have 3 or 4 what I call throwdown talks where I can deliver them very, very quickly and give people some thoughts. So my 10 Fs. You want to live a long time, not just length of life, but quality of life. Family, faith, friends, food, fun, funds, fitness, function, freedom, and fulfillment. And if you've got those going for you, God bless you. Those are the things that'll keep you alive a long time. So it's wrapping up these thoughts from everybody. I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your schedule. To our 3 panelists, Dr. James, Dr. Black, Dr. Steinberg, my hat's off to you for the work you're doing in your fields. Crawford, do we have any questions that popped up during this period of time?
Oh boy, do we. We have a lot of questions, and we're going to get to all of them that we can, but this is more questions than I've ever seen in a webinar. So I think that's a testament to just how important these topics are. I'm going to start off with this one because I think I mean, they're all important and great, but I really like this one. Any suggestions to first responders on how to transition from work life to home life?
Yeah, I can take that one. That's critical. I'm so glad someone asked that question. Take a look at Dr. Kevin Gilmartin's book, Emotional Survival for Law Enforcement. He talks about this directly, and here's what a lot of it boils down to: is understand you're going from one world to another world, two totally different worlds with different rules, different expectations, norms. And the classic thing is the first responder comes home exhausted. They've given everything on the job and they come home exhausted. And guess what? The families, then they're excited for you, you're home, all their energy's at a maximum now just when yours is crashing down. So there's this big opportunity to miss each other. What Dr. Gilmartin recommends is you take that 15 minutes that maybe you need to really decompress, change, etc., shift gears. Maybe you just need that time alone. But then don't settle into that, because what that leads to is, okay, now I'm just going to veg out and fall asleep and crash. What you want to do is take that 15 minutes. Sometimes maybe you need 30, but then you got to get up and do something active, whether it's go for a walk, whether it's exercise, whether it's playing with the kids, but purposefully and intentionally flipping that switch to get engaged with your life outside of work, and understand that's critically important for you, for your family, your loved ones, and for your health and well-being long term.
Thanks, Dr. Black. Crawford, another question?
Sure. Dr. James, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I mean, well, I think how do you shift in terms of sleep is probably a slightly different question. So I'll wait and see what others come up.
Sure. Okay. This next question is, can you please touch on the added stress that COVID-19 has caused public safety? Not just the safety measures for our personnel, but the overall impact it's had on our families, loss of life, job losses, financial impact, and so forth. And again, Dr. Black, I think that's probably natural for you to answer.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So Lancet Medical Journal published an article about a year ago, Psychological Impacts of Quarantine and How to Reduce Them. And it's a dark forecast, basically studying quarantine and pandemic situations worldwide in the past. And we've, of course, never had a pandemic like this, but we've had a lot of quarantine situations. Appreciate the fact that quarantine and the disease situation puts enormous stress on people. And as a result, you see increased rates of alcohol use. We've seen that go way up. You see increased rates of anger, and increased of a cluster of symptoms along the lines of post-traumatic stress. So this is difficult for everybody, but then the first responders are out there on the front line. They're getting exposed to this. Your risk for COVID exposure, very high as a first responder. The other thing we see is, what's your infectious viral load when you get hit with COVID? It's one thing if you're walking around the grocery store, right, and you inhale a stray molecule. It's another thing if you're in an arrest control situation, subduing a subject, you get sneezed on right in your face. That's a very different forecast. I think the research is going to bear that out more and more over time. So use your PPE. Understand this is an extremely stressful time for you and your family. You're not immune from it, and it affects different families differently. So, if you've got a great home life, God bless you, and it's one thing. But if you've got a strained home life or you live alone, then it's a very different thing. So make sure you're dealing with that, taking care of yourself. But also, I want all our first responders thinking about the fact that the population is under great stress right now. So when you're responding to the DV situations, when you're going and dealing with non-cooperative suspects, people are not at their best right now. People are stressed, they're strained, a lot of them have lost their jobs. Mental health issues are up right now. So be very aware of your safety, be very aware of officer safety. And do your best as much as you can to have patience with people right now, understanding that people are under a lot of stress and strain, and prioritize your own health and wellness even more so than you would otherwise.
That's great. And Dr. Scheinberg, I know you've talked to me about some of your experience as a cardiologist with stress and COVID. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, there's a few things. We actually just made a video for the National Law Enforcement Officer Memorial Fund regarding COVID and vaccination. So let me just hit on a couple of points, which interestingly tie into the last comment that Dr. Black made prior, and that is simple things. So when you're a cop, you don't always have the luxury of social distancing. It's just not in our, it's just not in a playbook. We have to get in there. And so here's what we really kind of push for. Obviously, PPE, continually washing your hands. When you get into your patrol car, take the opportunity to wipe it down first. When you get home at night, find an area in the garage or in the laundry room, or before, if you don't have the opportunity to change at your station, take off your duty belt, take off your gear, wipe it down, leave it outside, take off your boots, wipe those down. So separate your gear before you get into the house. That's actually a pretty interesting concept, because you can also use that time to just take a deep breath and decompress before you go in. And I want to use this opportunity to get back into the role of a physician and remind every single listener that the number one killer of law enforcement this year has been COVID. And I would recommend 100% that every person listening get the vaccine. This is not an experimental vaccine. Just because the approval process was streamlined does not mean this vaccine has not gone through phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. It's safe. It's effective. It does not mix with your DNA. It does not cause DNA mutations. There's no data out there that suggests this vaccination is any more dangerous than any other vaccinations that we've had. COVID is a much worse scenario than having a potential low-risk side effect from the vaccine. It does not cause infertility. It does not cause things like I've heard rumors of erectile dysfunction. These vaccines are safe and they're effective, and the only way out of this scenario is that the first responders, our medical personnel, and eventually the at-risk population get vaccinated.
Thank you very much, Dr. Scheinberg. Dr. James, we had a number of questions regarding preparing a firehouse for better sleeping. Any advice you have, even not just a firehouse, but in general, what can we do to improve our sleep? You mentioned a bunch of different ideas, but specific to a fire station, I guess.
Yeah, and obviously with a fire station, sometimes that can be extremely challenging because, you know, it might not necessarily be the optimal setting. So what you're going to have to do is, you know, I mean, you're going to have to create it individually as much as possible. So for example, you know, if you know that there's no way to keep the space quiet, you're going to have to play around with different earbuds and so on. And then of course have a system in place that if somebody needs to be woken up, they will get woken up. Right. Same with, same with keeping the space dark. If it really can't be kept dark, then you're going to have to play around with different face masks. And then, you know, I mean, there's lots of things that people ask me about. Well, what about things like gravity blankets and, you know, different apps and things like that that are designed to improve your sleep? I would say for any of those things, if you feel like they're making a difference, if you feel like they're being effective, then have at it. You know, by all means, go ahead. Just because something hasn't been through kind of rounds and rounds of validation testing doesn't mean it couldn't make you feel better necessarily when it comes to things like that. So yeah, so just play around with different options, and that's what I'd advise there.
Dr. Scheinberg, I've often heard that the best piece of exercise equipment ever invented is the one that you'll actually use.
That's correct. I mean, what we recommend from a cardiovascular perspective is, so the actual recommendation is 200 minutes per week, which is very difficult for a lot of people to hit. So being realistic, we recommend from an aerobic cardio conditioning, 30 minutes 3 or 4 times a week, and then resistance training 2 or 3 times a week, mixing it up. And if you do the same thing every workout, it doesn't work. You get bored, you get tired, your body gets used to it. In our field, we need physical strength, so resistance training is vital. But we also need cardiovascular strength and cardiovascular conditioning. I often get asked, okay, well, where should my heart rate be? You know, and we have such a proliferation of all these heart rate monitors and whatnot. And it's very simple. You don't need to check your heart rate. You should be exerting yourself until you're comfortably short of breath. If Gordon, if you and I are working out together right now and we're talking like we are now, we're not working hard enough. You should barely be able to carry on a conversation, with one little caveat, and that is if you are gearing your aerobic exercise to weight loss, it's better, for example, to walk a mile in 20 minutes than to run a mile in 10 minutes. So lower heart rates burn more calories and more fat than higher heart rates, but yet you don't get the cardiovascular conditioning. So we want to see both. And again, I tell my patients and my officers, mix it up. Have a CrossFit day, have a run or elliptical day. The Concept 2 rower is a marvelous piece of torture equipment that has made its way into law enforcement, especially here in Texas. And it's a tremendous aerobic and anaerobic conditioning tool. Resistance training, strength training is great. So you're absolutely right. If you have one piece of equipment and you use it constantly, you will get bored and your body gets accustomed to it. So mix it up the best you can.
Thank you, Doctor. Crawford, back to you to close it up.
Well, thank you everybody for attending. Thank you, Dr. James, Dr. Black, Dr. Scheinberg. Thank you as always, Gordon. Yes, once again, you will receive a certificate of attendance shortly. You also receive in a separate email a recording of this. Please share it far and wide. Check in with lexipol.com/webinars to get information about more upcoming webinars. And be safe, be healthy. Thank you.